also had what was he called his surgical
River king. It grows here naturally in Florida. It's very fine.
100.
Thank you for coming early, and I'm sorry that I had to get pushed up a little bit, but I guess the fire marshal always wins in the end, and it's something to do with the exits or something. But anyway, I'm always happy to talk with the FAS chapter. I have been involved in FAS and a couple of the different chapters throughout the state for a long time, and currently am an active member of Pensacola Archaeological Society, which is where I live now. And so it's always nice to come and give a talk and update so many of the important volunteers for archaeology around the state, and also to maybe welcome potential new members into the society and meet people who are generally supportive of anthropology and archaeology. But tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about a topic which I guess is pretty appropriate for October, although I was too dunce-like to put it together until someone else pointed it out to me. So I am going to talk a little bit about magic. And in particular, the way that magic is displayed and used at the household level, and how we can try to approach that in the archaeological record. And I have to give context because that's what archaeologists do, but the context of the data that I'll be presenting tonight is mainly from some households that I've looked at from Spanish St. Augustine or late Spanish colonial St. Augustine. And that was the late 1700s through the early 1800s, for those of you who are keeping track. And by that time period, Florida had been divided into two territories, East and West Florida, and that division had come under actually a short-lived English occupation and control of Florida. But Spain got the state back in I think 1782. And a lot of the Spaniards either returned from where they had been shuttled off to, or had been able, for one reason or another, to remain. And then a pretty good influx of more Creoles and Spaniards and people from different parts of the Caribbean and Mediterranean started arriving in both East and West Florida throughout this entire time period. And I like to point out that Florida at that time, you know, as an American and as a student in an American history class, you always learn about something called manifest destiny, and that's a big part of American history lessons. Well, Spanish colonists did not know this term. Nobody taught it to them in school, and they certainly didn't have in their minds the idea that it was a God-given right or a destiny of the United States to rule from shore to shore. So they were living in Florida as Spanish citizens. That was the dominant milieu. And they put security in local forms. Their security, as far as they were concerned, was in their allegiance to the Spanish colonial government, and they considered themselves subjects under the king. And they had no intention or no idea that they were presumed to be wanting to become American in any way, shape, or form. And I think sometimes Americans still have that problem when they look at the rest of the world. But anyway, probably a lot of you are familiar with St. Augustine. It's in Northeast Florida, of course. And this is a little bit later period of a map, but I like to use it because it's labeled in English, so it's easier for us screen goes to understand. But this is generally the layout of the town as it appeared from actually the earliest parts of the occupation and founding of St. Augustine all the way up to the present. This is still the layout of the downtown, and very little has changed as far as blocks, the way that the blocks are organized, and a lot of the houses, even if they're newer builds, are built on the same footprints. They've been rebuilt, or many late colonial buildings are still standing in St. Augustine. So it has a lot of the qualities that are historic and make it charming, although it's a lot cleaner now. And when we look at St. Augustine and towns like it, and I live in Pensacola, as I mentioned, and so Pensacola has a lot of this same thing going on. It's extremely charming in the downtown, and this is what people think of, the flowers, the bougainvillea, the vines, the balconies and things like that, the good old days. But St. Augustine was actually probably a pretty stinky, smelly place at the time. And actually with the horses and the tourist carriages, it sometimes still is. But this is more maybe a picture into what reality looked like sometimes, for a lot of these folks anyway. And I like to think of different ways of knowing the past. And one of the ones that have become increasingly popular in the last couple of years is called an archaeology of the senses. And looking and trying to envision and imagine different ways that people experience the world around them, just like we do. And the archaeology of smell actually has gotten a lot of play in the last few years. So when I look at this picture, I know what I would be smelling. And if you've ever been in New Orleans in an early morning after a big night, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So an archaeology of the smell, there it is in picture format. But anyway, I want to just throw this up real quick. And St. Augustine is one of the lucky few cities actually in the United States, and especially in Florida, that have city ordinances guarding the protection of their archaeological resources. The city is broken up into archaeological zones, and of course they're based on proximity to the colonial core of the city. And all of the sites that I'm looking at tonight are from within that colonial core, except for one, and that is outside the city gates past the fort. And it was a farmstead that was out in that area. But the rest of them are right down in the city core in the old Colonial District. And for the, have any of you, I'm sure a lot of you have been to St. Augustine, but you know it has the small plaza, and then on both sides of that it radiates out the Colonial District that we call it. And so generally on, is there a flashy thingy? A pointer, yes. So here we have in this area would be the government structures and where the governor lived and higher officials grouped right around the plaza. This side of town was, and especially right along the plaza here, would have been the very most wealthy people in the community living here and a few rows back. In this area, of course, was all along the wharves. There were many, many, many wharves coming out all along the shoreline, and that was a merchant-oriented area. Then back here, actually, you have what's known as a Minorcan district, because there was a large influx of Minorcan settlers into the area in this time period, although it was mixed with other Spanish citizens of all groups, but it was called the Minorcan district. Even then, it was called the Minorcan district, and it's still called that. So that's the 9 houses in the study. And for better or for worse, all the data, of course, is again produced from either the City of St. Augustine Archaeological Program, and or a couple of the household data sets come from field schools that were either excavated by Florida State University in the 80s or the Florida Museum of Natural History in the 80s and 90s. So, but that's only a few of them. The rest do come from the City Archaeology Program, and when I say program, I mean program of one man, and there is one archaeologist in St. Augustine, and he's responsible for just a busload of work. You can't imagine how busy he is all the time. So he has a lot of very dedicated volunteers, thank God, but it is a lot of times down to salvage type work, which means that the archaeological data that I can include has to come from closed context features that are somewhat reliably dated to the right time period. And when I say closed context features for people who are not archaeologists, that simply means that it is a deposit in the ground that we can tell by looking at the stratigraphy, the up and down vertical stratigraphy, and also the horizontal context of that deposit, that it has not been disturbed by later activities, and also is not mixed with things that have come earlier. A lot of times in the lab, we can sort that situation out even if it occurs, but sometimes we can't, which means we find really cool stuff, but it's not in a reliable context, so it can't be included. So I just want to mention that real quick. But here's some pictures of Carl laboring away, the one-man show. God love him. And a lot of the material is really magnificent, but of course a lot of it is mundane. And we're all used to seeing, especially historic archaeologists, these are very familiar to our eyes. We know what these are. They're imported wares from Europe. Some are from Mexico. We find them all jumbled together in the screen. But because St. Augustine is such an amazing place, and I have a sneaking suspicion that there's areas of Tampa that would yield the same level of amazing archaeology. We do get into features sometimes where we are able to get, whole vessels and things like that, just like you would on a prehistoric site when you get lucky. But so we usually have jumbled, but sometimes we get this. And for many, many years in archaeology, and it's still extremely useful and popular, and is a very productive avenue of inquiry, the main focus of household assemblage studies has been ceramics. And it's because they are eye-catching, and they are also extremely hardy in the archaeological record, and they're some of the more numerous things that you find on both a prehistoric site after a certain time period and on historic sites. So there's been a lot of emphasis and questions focused on these kinds of artifacts related to socioeconomic status of households and other kinds of great questions. And there's been a lot done where we really can focus in on the people inside the houses, not just the owners that might show up in the historical records, but the everyday folks, part of the households, not necessarily part of the family, but part of the household, the larger households that we want to talk about and get at. And I do love this painting by Goya. It's one of my favorites, and I try to always work it in there somehow. But when we get lucky, we find things like this, and I always think of this beautiful lady and try to keep my mind on the people within the houses. So, but saying all that, this emphasis on magic is part, and religiosity, and I'll get to that word in a minute, but is part of a larger study that is my dissertation, focusing on personal ornamentation and personal objects from within the household. And the organization of all of that data is based on a book by Kathleen Deegan, who's a historical archaeologist recently retired from the Florida Museum. And this is the book. It's her second artifact book. She published another one about 10 years prior to this, and this is already about 8 years old. But this is sort of the organization of the material from my dissertation. But we're going to focus in on one subset of that in a minute. But I thought I would very quickly go through the different categories that have popped up in St. Augustine, because some of them are really magnificent. And there is so much potential, so many questions that haven't been asked. Some have been asked and then just shunted to the side because, quite frankly, it seems almost impossible to answer them sometimes with archaeology. Some have been played to death, and it's time to move on. But we have many beautiful objects that can be associated with religious beliefs, and also personal ornamentation, which of course is very important and plays into that display of religiosity. Here's some of the other ones, and we'll come back to some of these in a moment. And then we have, of course, another category of study for my dissertation, and that's clothing objects. And I'll ask you to remember a couple of these, in particular this one, when we get going a little bit, and also the scissors. Remember that. And then, of course, there's also fabulous finds like the fan. And there's no person in here who wouldn't be thrilled to find a fan like that just because it's stinking cool. Normally, you just find one slat of it, but every now and then you get lucky and you come up with the whole enchilada. The thing in the middle is actually part of a parasol. Then you have personal objects like these, and in particular, pay attention to this one. And this is, of course, an artist's rendition of one of the actual subjects living in St. Augustine at that time, and she is very visible in the historical archaeological record, so it's led to some storytelling and imagination about her life, because she was a mulatto and rose to be a slave and property owner herself. So people like to talk about Nancy, but she originally was a slave-born. Then we have some of the personal items generally associated with men, but again, we can keep our eye on some of these. In particular, we can look at these knives and the sword hilts and things like that. And of course, most of us will know about these and have experience with them on a personal level of some sort through our years, and a lot of gaming and pastime objects that we do find in the archaeological record. But again, this talk isn't about all that jazzy material, although there's definitely overlap between all the categories. I want to focus a little bit, or try to, on the archaeology of religion and magic. And I want to just say that to me, those two things go together. They're the same. And anthropologists generally like the term religiosity. And basically, religiosity is what I would describe as the everyday playing out of religion in your lives. You could also use the phrase vernacular religion. And it's basically how a very high religion, a high formalized form of magic and religion, like Catholicism, comes together with everyday action and sort of the interplay of your faith and how you maneuver through the day. And I know that it is hard for Protestants, and in particular, I grew up a Southern Baptist, so I knew nothing about Catholicism growing up, and it was actually considered extremely exotic and foreign to me as a Southern Baptist. But I think that, especially in the Tampa area, which is one of the Catholic strongholds still in Florida, and places like St. Augustine and Pensacola, where there are large Catholic populations, the interplay of material culture that you can touch and identify and religion is not foreign to us. And actually, if I examine my childhood roots in the Southern Baptist Church, there are many materials that I can reach out and touch. We did even have, we do the body of Christ on special occasions only with a wafer and things like that. But there are many examples that any of us can look around and see. But religiosity in daily lives in the Spanish colonial world was very deeply rooted and very much part of all day. It just was all around you all day. You didn't have to think about it. It was just what you did. It was part of what you did and who you were. And when you want to study archaeology and magic, you have to ask yourself, which is why I had the thinking guy up there, and I love him, because he is just like this stony weight with all these questions. He never seems to move very far forward. But religion and archaeology is kind of one of those stony weights. But we all do know a little bit about magic, no matter what background we come from. If we had English class in high school, then we are at least familiar with some of this phrasing. And probably Shakespeare was pushed on us at some point. And so this is what is in the general mindset. When they think of magic, they think of the three nasty witches in the Shakespeare tale in the cave. And if you've taken a history class at the high school level in the United States, this is also what you know about magic. And it's usually focused on witches, something outside of yourself, something outside the everyday, something feared, and things like that. So we all know the debacle of the Salem witch trials and how that turned out. But for most of us, our education is a little bit closer to home. We learn things, of course, from TV. And I watched many, many reruns of Bewitched growing up. I loved the program and thought it was a lot of fun. And then, of course, you have The Wizard of Oz, which is an image that is in all of our minds, especially with the nasty, unnecessary flying monkeys. They completely unnecessary, but we all know good from bad witches. We know good from bad magic. And this is how a lot of us come into that kind of knowledge of white magic versus dark magic. And then, of course, today, no kid who's alive today doesn't know who these people are, either through the book or the movies series by J.K. Rowling, copyright since I'm being filmed. But this is what we know. And actually, there's a lot of historical research. A lot of course, is wrong and fictionalized in her book, but she definitely incorporates a lot of tradition, especially in terms of material culture, that you can pick up on as you read through the Harry Potter books, including right down to things like Azor stones and things like that. So there is a lot going on in there that kids pick up on, and it just goes into our minds. But when magic, as separate from religion, is studied in archaeology, this is what it started off focusing on, which are what I call spectacular finds or special finds. And it's things that are generally separated out from everyday life, but it has to do with a lot of objects that would be concealed in liminal spaces, in hidden spaces. And what I mean by liminal spaces is sort of in between reality and non-reality, like in doorways or attics or window frames or walls, sort of protective areas of the house that aren't part of your everyday, but they are where spirits can leak in and get a hold. So also too in trees, on your property, things like that. So of course, because they're awesome, witch bottles are interesting, and they're not as relevant or as prevalent, I should say, on Spanish colonial sites, but you do find them sometimes in different kinds of contexts. But a lot of the more spectacular ones are associated with colonial New England and also pretty widespread all through medieval Europe. And also they still find them dating into the 19th century and 20th century in Europe and England. But all historic archaeologists know what these kinds of jars are. They're salt glazed stoneware. They have particular names and dates, and it's very cool if you can find them. But what's inside in the early days, they were a preferred type of bottle, although there is a lot of glass ones used too. Old specifically, it was better if the bottles are older and beat up. But you do find sometimes that they still have the contents, the stoppers are still in them, or maybe the stoppers are gone, but the contents are still in them, and they have a lot of similarities in what would be inside of them. And that includes, and these are all traditions that go back into the medieval period and before that, way before that, to Greeks and Romans. A lot of things that you would see in a witch bottle now would be very, very similar to what you would see from one that was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old, including pins, especially bent pins, urine, usually if they have a liquid in them, it's human urine, and human hair, things like that. Often things like this leather heart that has been obviously stabbed, and all kinds of nasty little bits. And witch bottles, here's a little bit later of an example of one, and we all know the olive green wine bottle glass, and in the colonial period, the wine bottle glasses were very popular. Here's an x-ray of one from Maine. And then I just want to point out that growing up in the South, again, as an aspect of just viewing religiosity with fresh eyes, once you know how to, or you start to think about it, or you want to, it becomes more visible all around you. In the South, I grew up in DeLand, Florida, which is in Central Florida. It's not a super tiny town, but it's certainly not a big one either, and it's surrounded by a lot of rural areas, or at least it used to be. And you do see still, and saw even more when I was a kid, examples of this, which is a witch bottle tree, and this is still a common and popular thing to do that you see a lot around the South. Actually, it's been co-opted by yuppies everywhere, and they sell metal ones, and you can go and put your favorite champagne bottle on it. But so it's there around you if you want to see it. There's other examples too that have long histories and things you think, why is that guy sweeping the dirt in front of his house? But there's a reason for that. There's customs behind everything. And so it's nice to look. But most of archaeology is the crushed up stuff. We don't get the whole stuff. We're not that lucky. Occasionally we will. But a lot of times we're just stuck, and so we have to make some imaginative leaps to get to the right questions, or the questions that count, that we want to ask. Here's another painting by Goya. He, of course, is a painter who loved painting the everyday people. He did a lot of courtly paintings, but in his free time and the time that he had to himself, he would go to the local pub or whatever, and he loved to capture the emotion. And this is also a painting that I love. But this is what we're left with, the broken up bits, and how do we recover that archaeologically. This is actually from a CRM project that I participated in quite a number of years ago. Not quite a number, so I'm not that old, but like 7 years ago or something, or 6 years ago. Feels like forever. But it was a really cool little farmstead in St. Aug, and we actually did recover 2 bottles. Remember what I said about liminal spaces? We recovered 2 whole bottles in the foundation of this house, and it was just a post and sill, very modest structure. Yet they were in a very isolated and obvious context, and we very imaginatively described them as bottles in a footer. Like, we just didn't know much about which bottles or even the possibility of which bottles, but so we didn't do quite the best job we could, but it's good that we did that, because you can go back and cipher on it years later when you learn more things and think, hey, I've actually seen that in action, I've seen that come up. And you can go and look in the context with the bottles, and then you can see, oh yeah, there was a bent pin there with it. Okay, that's pretty cool. What's going on there? And then when you get to that level of thinking, then you start questioning all of the things around you. And I showed you this one before, this slide earlier, and I told you to keep an eye on this little guy. This is from a site in the core of St. Augustine, the Colonial core. And obviously it is a fragment of a knife. And it was listed in the report from the city, where it normally is found, which is under personal objects, possible knife fragment. And then again listed in the appendix in the faunal listings, because obviously it's a bone handle knife. And that's what you get in a lot of archaeology reports. But when you start ciphering through all your questions and going back and look at the context of these personal objects, then you think, is there any interesting way I can associate this? Is there any creative way I can associate this with something else? And then you see, oh, this was found in a feature that is part of a door sill. Okay, so what's going on there? And then you think, it wasn't just discarded trash, it was probably put there on purpose. And of course, a knife has a long history as a warding object, just like the pins do, seen as capable of actually cutting and breaking curses. And that is pretty common. So a lot of this has to come through personal imagination, of which I've never run out of, because I get bored and keep going on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So I feel like sometimes I'm making it up, but then I remind myself and make a list. Oh no, I'm not making it. Between the archaeology and the research, and coming up with some new questions that I can try to ask and answer using the archaeological data. And there's a little bit of a close-up of it. It actually did have a little iron rivet in it, but so again, going back to the bottles and the other fantastic finds, in general, when we look at archaeology and magic, not archaeology and religion, but separating out magic as its own thing, which I don't want to do, this is what we think of. We think of these separate finds, isolated from daily life. We think of, and I'm sure, have any of you ever heard of shoes, or shoes being like concealed in walls or in attics? Or very commonly, actually the most common placement of an old shoe would be in a hearth, and the second most common would be in an attic, and the third most common would be in walls. And this is data that's come from all over the US and, of course, England and parts of Europe. But shoes are another magical item associated with warding, and you either had to burn old shoes because it would bring bad luck onto the family, or use them as a ward. And these are families who are Catholic, who would obviously say they were Christians, Protestants and Catholics, but they abided by the old ways. It did have significance. It does cross their mind to do these things, and they did it on purpose, and it's there for us to find. And of course, then you have really amazingly scary things sometimes, like the cats. Cats were a really popular thing to conceal in walls, and they weren't put in there alive. They were either a dead cat or were killed and were left to dry and then placed in a certain posture and then put into a wall. A lot of times you'll see them chasing rats that have also been dried, or stepping on a rat, or holding another bone in its mouth, or something equally kind of creepy. Another thing that we find sometimes is skulls concealed in walls. I love this picture, and I did put this gal in here because you see how happy she looks with her shoes? Like, this is what I would feel like if I found a big pile of old shoes concealed in a wall. So normally they're concealed as single shoes, never with their mate, but occasionally they were with their mate, and sometimes it would be a big pile, and none of these are mated shoes. They're all boots of different sizes. And so this archaeologist is from Australia, but I just like her look of archaeological contentment in the moment. So I'm including her picture. But again, for most historical archaeologists and most archaeologists in general, you know, we don't get to dig on mounds anymore. We don't get to dig into graves. We don't have the grave goods. We don't have the concealed shoes most of the time. What we have is people living in houses, people making trash piles behind their houses, people dropping stuff where they walked every day, and in general occupying their space. And a lot of their time and energy were spent in the household, whether they were part of the blood family or part of the extended network of a household. And when I say household, I refer always to all of those people, not just the family nucleus, because of course, how am I going to sort that out? Although you can, but it gets very hard. And so, just like in prehistoric archaeology, there's been sort of a trending on trying to address questions of spirituality and daily religiosity in people's lives away from these specialized areas, away from the mounds. And that's, I mean, obviously for a good reason. We can't dig into them. But another good reason is that's what we have as archaeologists. We dig into household middens, we dig into broken up trash. And in historical archaeology, I always used to think that it would be a more satisfying and maybe even slightly easier job and task than prehistoric archaeologists have, because we do have the abundance of the historical record and art world to help us along in visualizing all these possibilities and all these avenues of inquiry. But now I realize I chose very poorly. I should have become a prehistoric archaeologist, because it's frickin' double the work at least, and you usually have to learn a couple of foreign languages and paleography, and it freaking takes forever. but there is that bounty, so let's get back to the positive angle of it. And you do have beautiful sources to draw on. And when you're talking about households and trying to visualize different possibilities, we have amazing art and amazing writings that we can look at and reference. And of course, if you know anything about Spanish colonial history, then you probably, or done any reading into it, then you've probably seen some of these images before. These are Costa paintings, and they all date somewhere in the 1700s. I think there's a couple sets that date into the early 1800s, but almost all of the sets of the sets, because they do come in sets of paintings that go together, are from the 1700s. But what Costa paintings are is not this. A Costa painting is not this, which is by an unknown artist, but this is a scene from a market of everyday action. This is people on the street. This is people buying things from their home and moving in and out, and it's supposed to be a reflection of reality. And that's, of course, what household archaeology is always trying to get at. Costa paintings are extremely stylized paintings. They were made for a very specific audience. They're always of New World subjects. And what Costa paintings are, in a nutshell, is they're sets of, I think it's 16 that usually come in each set, starting with a Spaniard and whoever that person married. And then whatever that racial caste is of that marriage produces a new category of human being at the bottom. And they were a way, these sets of paintings were a way for the officials, the government officials in Spain, to sort of control and visualize what was going on in their colony, which was basically the intermarriage of everyone all together. And it was a mixing of all of these different kinds of people from all over the world, and it made them extremely nervous. And so it was their attempt through art to control. And it's simply the way that early biology and science was done, where every species was broken down. And it's very, very similar to that. And so in English, you'll have something like, and it gets more degenerative, of course, the further you go away from white. And white, for the Spanish, meant anyone who did not have Islamic or Jewish blood in their heritage. And also later, it meant anyone who did not have any African blood in their heritage. So you started with this ideal and then sort of went down the scales. And it would include mulattoes, mixed race, like Indians and Spaniards in the New World, and Spaniards and slaves in the New World. And so it had a series of categorizing that people could deal with in Spain. But so again, they're not true to life. They're not Goya. Okay, Goya would have just like been freaked out if he could have ever seen this stylized production. They're not the scene in the market, but they are telling a story very, very specifically. And because it's so detailed, we can use them to visualize, and it's extremely helpful in archaeology. And archaeologists love and hate the Casta paintings for many, many different reasons. But when we look at them like this, we can get a lot of clues. And I hope that some of these slides, I tried to improve them, but a lot of them are a little bit blurry. But when we look at these, we can see some of the material we might pick up in an everyday context in a household that maybe we've categorized one way. And when we think in terms of religiosity, we can get creative and go back and try to categorize it in another way. And I want you to look at the jewelry that, of course, this young gal, and the way she's dressed depicts her obviously as a servant. Then you have this very beautiful Native American woman, and she's wearing traditional costume. Then you have here a Spaniard in his traditional costume, and then of course their baby right here. But this young gal's carrying him on her back, and so we know that she's probably a servant. But we can look at all the details of their costuming and think about it in maybe different ways. And this is, for this purposes of this talk and this type of research, we want to look at it in from the perspective of religion and magic, and everyday magic, a vernacular magic and religion. And when I look at some of the objects that are very, very clearly associated with spirituality, then we can acknowledge a long, long history of Catholicism in these people's everyday lives. And I don't know if anybody in the audience is Catholic or has any knowledge of it, but this is a figa, and this is a very common amulet that you see associated in Spanish cultures all over the world. And it is a ward for the evil eye. This figa in particular is from the Fountain of Youth site in St. Augustine, 16th century site. And very, very early, it's actually the founding site of St. Augustine, so it pretty much doesn't get earlier than that for St. Augustine. And but you look at that, but then you look at things just like the red beads, you have the white bead, and you have why is Debbie showing pictures of busted up teeth? What's going on there? But when you understand and look at these paintings and go through the literature, that there's so many different objects that can be used in terms of a religious way of thinking, a religious way of living, that we really need to pay a little bit more attention to detail. This object in particular is an amulet that wards evil eye, but in a more practical sense, all babies wore them because they were used as teething toys. And they were usually made of glass, but sometimes they were made of coral. Especially red coral was extremely coveted. And you look at things like this white bead, and it looks terribly unimpressive. But when we go back to our ladies and look at this lady's neck and then we turn and see that she has a young baby. White is very often associated with calling up and helping in lactation in Spanish cultures. So not always depending so much on context, not being solely, I gave you that mini lecture earlier about context and how we often have to be wary of context. And of course that's true in archaeology. But when I say context here, let's look again at all our contexts. It doesn't have to be this amazing secreted one. If we find white beads in the midden of this kind of household, we know the history of the household, or at least the history of the region. Let's think about it a little bit more creatively. Yes, it is a bead. Yes, it's personal ornamentation. It can be very beautiful, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have simultaneous meanings. And then, of course, you have some of the other more obvious things. Oh, did I show the coins? Coins, too, I want to just point out very quickly, because, of course, we all know about pierced coins as charms and trinkets. We know about bent coins and things like that, but what if they're not bent? What if they're not pierced? Is that a way of, you know, can we still think of them? Can we still ask questions about other roles they might have played? In particular, if we know the date of a household or the general date of a household and the coin is much earlier and it's a pretty clean context, can we ask other questions like that? Can we look at the coin and look to see if it has a cross on it, which means one thing, or if it has a king's seal, which of course, I say of course, but not of course if you don't know it, but the king's seal, or the signage of a king, which is supposed to cast protection and strength onto the wearer or the holder, and things like that. And of course the very material itself, silver, which is a strong theme in amulets. And then we have things like the shark's teeth up here, and we find, this is an important one too, we find, especially in the faunal data, until more recently, it's a topic that is generally ignored in most archaeological reports, especially in a CRM environment. And I want to say that is because it takes a lot of specialized skill to deal with faunal artifacts, and it takes a long time, and it's hard, so most of us don't know that much about it. But when we do find things like teeth and horn, we need to take another look, because it's a very, very common substance that was used to make amulets out of quite often. And in that previous photo I did show, this one is from St. Augustine, and it was, of course, made from a shark's tooth, as you can see there. And you do have all of these amazing finds that are easily associated, like the rosary beads in the corner and the cross, and you'll have your faceted beads, and we feel comfortable in a setting like St. Augustine associating those with rosaries, especially when we understand how much crystal quartz was valued in both Europe and in the New World, and especially among southeastern Native American tribes, as having amuletic properties. And when we see those in context here, we can think about the syncretism going on there and understand that it was a very, very valuable material for many cultures. And we can focus on color, not just shape, but on color and context, and be creative. And then there's things that, just like the shark's teeth, it's cool to find a key, but what do you make of it until you understand that keys were part of amuletic charm, not bracelets, but women often wore them tied around their waists, associated with household, like the dutiful wife, the good luck of the household, and things like that, and service to the household. And so when you find a key, yeah, it's just a key, and it probably did unlock something at one point, otherwise it wouldn't have been made. But if you look at a key from a different perspective, you can ask a few other questions and be a little bit more creative. I mean, this one has a stain on it, for saint's sake. So, but especially in Catholic strongholds like St. Augustine was, like Pensacola was, and of course all the influx of Catholics into this area, we want to always pay attention. Archaeologists need to pay much more attention to color of the finds of these everyday objects, because color is of such significance. And I'm only giving you 3 examples here, but these are 3 very important primary colors in the Catholic universe, but other colors, especially blue and gold and purple, they all have very significant meanings. And it's not just going to be in a sacred context, and it's also not going to be in very specialized material. A lot of times, you know, folks are poor and they can't afford emeralds. They're going to take a green glass. They can't afford coral, maybe charms, and a lot of times the stand-in for that will be something tied with colored ribbon, a colored ribbon tied around a baby's hand, a choker made from colored velvet, and things like that. So there's all kinds of ways to work these into the everyday, and we have to come up with all kinds of ways to work them into our archaeological imagination. Again, the emphasis on color. These are some of the beads from houses in St. Augustine, and some of them are going to be much more obvious than others, as you know, coming off as very, very obviously different kinds of rosary type beads dating to all time periods. But this one especially, this one I already showed you as an example of a potential lactation device. This one and this one, green and red. Let's think about it. Green, of course, was a very sacred color, and still is, and still very popular in the Catholic universe. And red, of course, red, especially coral, because red is the color of blood. Red is the color of virility. It's the color of masculinity. Many amulets associated with men are made from red stones, and especially coral. But even down to branch coral, and I don't know if there's any Italians in here, but this is a symbol that's extremely common still, as many of these amulet forms are, especially the figa and things like that, all throughout the Catholic universe. The horn, branch coral, obviously this is a more stylized horn made of silver, but this is a piece of branch coral, and again, it's blood, it's masculinity. It's associated with fertility, and it's extremely popular still throughout the Catholic world. And I told you we'd come back to this in particular, and I have to say that I am very, and always have been, even though I'm horrible at sewing and Wisho is a lot better, I've always had a real love of objects associated with sewing and embellishment and clothing and things like that. So I always get a kick out of it. But these are some of the finds from a house in St. Augustine. This in particular is a thimble that would have been a child-sized thimble. So of course it's a teaching tool and things like that, and baby helps mommy, or young servant helps older servant. There's all kinds of scenarios. This is an artifact that holds pins and is worn around the neck or off the belt sash or things like that. But when you think about things more creatively, keep asking questions in different ways of your what seems to be the same old data sets. Again, these pins were put into a tidy table, and as well as the artifacts underneath them, a table labeled sewing related objects. Creative, right? But no, when you realize that the bent pin, remember what I talked to you about, the bottles, witch bottles and things like that, the bent pin is found in association with a bottle, not other things related to sewing. Okay, so let's get creative, folks, and come at it from, and I'm not lecturing you, I'm lecturing myself. Okay, so let's be a little more prone to thinking creatively. And again, our shark teeth, because flipping to the back of a CRM report, you might see teeth, you might see horns, but why, if you're looking at a household assemblage, why do you have teeth, and why isn't that sticking out to you as something odd if the rest of your assemblage is post-butchering items and things like that? So there are ways to more systematically think about this stuff. It's not just imaginatively, but if the butchering is going on somewhere else and you also have teeth in a midden, what else might be going on? Let's just ask the question. And of course, in this charm, you have it mounted on both sides, but it could the tips of these could be very easily knocked off in the archaeological record if the setting for the amulet was gone. So just keep pushing it, keep asking questions, because it's there. It's all around these people, and we have to figure out a way to let these kinds of artifacts be part of our interpretation of the site, because they're so incredibly important in the daily lives of these people. And then again, these are coins that date much earlier, found in midden deposits and trash pits and wells from the second Spanish period, but none of them are pierced. But you can see that some of them are very well worn, as if they might have been curated for a long time. None of them are bent, but when you look at what the emblems on the coins are, Catholic crosses and things like that. So there's all kinds of ways. And actually there's been a lot of research on coins, not just in a Catholic context, but in African American and other cultures around the world. And historic archaeologists are right now doing some great research on it. There's an archaeologist at UF, James Davidson, who's really interested in religious artifacts associated with African American sites. And he's published some really neat stuff. And again, just like our plain lowly coins, we have, not all of it can be, this cool. And when we get, if any of us gals have ever been in a bead shop, or if you're a fan of jewelry in general, then you'll know that you know what this is, and you see the beads all over, evil eye beads. I was just at a Greek festival last weekend at an Orthodox church, and there was a huge basket of evil eye pendants and beads for sale next to the baked goods. So it's still out there, folks, and we know what this is. We know what that is when we find it, and that's pretty stinking groovy. But what about this sad looking thing? What would you think of it? But when you know that certain materials inherently have amuletic properties, and quartz crystal is one of them, then we can rethink our analysis a little bit. And then there's things which is always frustrating, but maybe it's good for me. I might finish my dissertation if I can come to an end of my research at some point, but there's loads of categories of materials that will never make it into the archaeological record because they're too fragile. But we get glimpses of them again in our artwork and things like this. And I love this because when we look at that, we know that it's a beauty mark, right? But this was a very, very popular effect that women put on. Usually they were cut from velvet or some other material and applied to the face. And it was seen as a very beautiful and fashionable thing to do because it mimicked a beauty mark, but it also was a charm to ward for headaches. And so you'll see them a lot in paintings of high level or close to Spanish as you can get, paintings of women and children. You'll see these pieces of material applied to their face. And that's what I'm trying to do with the household data from St. Augustine. And it's a work, in progress. More and more researchers are getting interested in these kinds of questions. Certainly I'm not the first one, and I'm not the best one. These artifacts are all from San Luis in Tallahassee, and some of them are pretty famous and have been published on pretty extensively, especially this cross right here. And if you remember that I told you that that the quartz crystal was very meaningful in both a Catholic setting and in a Native American setting in the Southeast, and crystal and the cross itself, not just the material, but the cross itself, were associated with many, many different groups of people in the Southeast. And crystal was often used to forecast into the future, bring good luck in hunting, attract the opposite sex, things like this in both historic and prehistoric tribes, and that's known ethnographically. And we can witness this in the archaeological record. This cross was studied very extensively and is actually found to be native quartz, or from this area, the native quartz crystal, and was probably done by a native artisan because of the types of tools they know that went into the making of the cross. The figa also, and although the one at the top is a European quartz crystal. And so you can see how those, if you're just looking at this amazing, beautiful cross, you might just say, oh, there's a cross. We know what that means. But when you think in terms of syncretism and the long history of the object on both sides of the Atlantic and the different meanings of the materials, you can come up with all kinds of stories. And really that's what archaeology is. It's controlled storytelling. At least that's what it is to me. And it's storytelling with data, because otherwise you're never going to get to these people, and you're never even going to be able to envision their faces. Certainly, a lot of these objects have traditions in a lot of cultures around the world. This is another kind of hand amulet found on a slave site from Virginia. Like I said, just like the one in Tallahassee, these ideas are being fleshed out all over the United States in historical archaeology. But again, how else are we going to get to these people? You know what? Their socioeconomic status was not as important to them as their spirituality. And these people, especially in the Catholic universe at that time period, religion is how they dealt with a mean and nasty world. Remember the passageway of 1,000 smells I showed you? Remember the cramped quarters they were living in? You know what? They all went to church and there was a process that they went through, but when they got home and were dealing with their daily lives, the religiosity that comes into play is how they make it through the day. And it's how a lot of people still make it through the day. And so archaeology has to apply some more questions to these kinds of problems. But here's some more beautiful people I'll leave you with. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have them. Thank you.